Hello, I'm George Brown, and today the theme for our Armchair Traveler experience is a great American road trip. When I think of that term, the great American road trip, I think of really three things maybe. The great open spaces of this continent, this country of ours, the highway network that connects it, and the automobile, the classic American automobile. And so all of us have been on different kinds of road trips. And today I want to take a look at some of the classic road trips and also think with you a little bit about future road trips that we might be able to take in the days ahead. But before we can have a road trip, we need to have a road. And there hasn't always been those kinds of roads in this country. You'll remember if you joined us for our Lewis and Clark episode a few weeks ago, that in 1803, Thomas Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark on an expedition from the East Coast, almost the East Coast, Pittsburgh, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, trying to see if there was a river road, a river highway, and that was the preferred highway of the day. They were thinking that maybe they could connect the Missouri River that flows into the Mississippi and the Columbia River that flows into the Pacific. But they found that that was not to be. The mountains were too formidable in between. And so it was a failure in terms of finding a highway east to west. But soon after that, not too many years after that, there developed a series of roads across the country, overland routes. One of the first was the Santa Fe Trail. This went from Independence, Missouri. As it turns out, most of these trails originated in Independence, Missouri. If you look on the map, you'll see that Independence, Missouri is the westernmost leg of the Missouri River that the large boats could traverse in those days. So people would go by boat to Independence, Missouri, and then set out west on the wagon roads. Santa Fe Trail was opened in 1821, followed in 1843 by the Oregon Trail, probably a more famous trail that you've heard about. And then there was a California Trail that was particularly important during the years of the California Gold Rush. It's estimated that between 1848 and 1850, upwards of around 75,000 people migrated to California via the California Trail. And so these trails from the 1820s up to the 1880s provided the westward march of the American pioneer and entrepreneur. You'll remember when we talked about Thomas Jefferson, that he had a vision, as did others, that the United States would be a continental country that would go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Manifest destiny is what we came to refer to this westward march in the 19th century. Of course, it meant traversing land that in fact was occupied by other peoples, by the Native Americans and even the Spanish who had been there for centuries before. But for the American pioneers, for the American westward expansion, these roads, these wagon trails, became the way that the West would be traversed and eventually would be populated. But something happened in the 1880s or so that changed all of that, and that was the coming of the railroad. The first transcontinental railroad was completed in 1868. When we talked about Lewis and Clark, I shared with you a book I like by Stephen Ambrose. As it turns out, there's another book, also by Stephen Ambrose, about the Transcontinental Railroad. Nothing in the world like it. And subtitled, The Men Who Built the Transcontinental Railroad, 1863 to 1869. It's a great story of how that engineering feat was done. It's not just engineering, but it was political and economic as well. Using Chinese immigrants or Chinese labor coming from California, using primarily Irish labor. So this great railroad being built by two of America's great immigrant groups. But once that was completed in the late 1860s, there was an incredible amount of railroad building that took place all over the United States, including the east to west. So that by the 1880s, travel by rail had basically made the trails, the Santa Fe Trail, the wagon trails obsolete. And so for a generation, it was by railroads that the overland journey was taken in this country. But around the turn of the century, that began to change again. And this time it was another vehicle, not a railroad this time, but the automobile that would change everything for that generation and for our generation as well. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the development of that highway system. But first, let's take a look at some of these maps so you get a feel for what was happening in these days. So here you have maps showing these Western trails from the 19th century. You see the Santa Fe, most of them originating here in Independence, Missouri, right on the edge of what was known as the Great Plains at the time. So people would come by boat or overland to Independence, Missouri, and they get in their wagon trains and head west. So the movement down to Santa Fe on the Santa Fe Trail, the Oregon Trail coming south of the route that Lewis and Clark had taken, coming south of that and then heading into Oregon. And then when it came time for the California Gold Rush, the California Trail branched off of the Oregon Trail. There's another one here, the Mormon Trek, showing the route that the Mormons took, overlapping the Oregon Trail when they got to, till they got to Salt Lake City and settled there. So these were the great Western trails, as I said, from the 1820s to 1880s. American folklore is filled with stories of these trails. It's during these years that, at least in our corporate memory, that we think of the cowboy culture, the independence, a rugged cowboy. Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play, where never is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. So these stories, the legends and myth of the great Western expansion took place during these years using these wagon trains. This is the image that we have of the great wagon trains going across the desert and the mountains till they reach their destination. It would take 3 to 6 months in these wagons, with the people riding in the wagons, but also walking much of the way. So this was in the mid part of the 19th century, but then May 10th, 1869, everything began to change, where you had the joining of the two railroads. You know the story of where they came. There was a race by the two companies, the Central Pacific, Union Pacific, who would get the farthest. So they met in Utah, and the Transcontinental Railroad was incomplete. And so from then, it was railroad until 1903, a man that I had never heard of until I was doing a little research for this session, Horatio Nelson Jackson. What a great name. And Bud is a little dog here. It's a story that reminds me of Phileas Fogg. You remember Phileas Fogg, Around the World in 80 Days. So Phileas Fogg made a wager that he could go around the world in 80 days in the 1870s. He would do it by rail and steamship. But this Horatio Jackson, in a tavern in San Francisco in 1903, wagered some friends that he could drive across the continent in an automobile. This was unheard of, early days of the automobile. But he bet $50 that he could drive across the continent. And whereas it took Phileas Fogg in the fiction in 1872, 80 days to go all the way around the world, it took Horatio Jackson 64 days, but he was successful. Going with another man rode with him who was a mechanic. Incredible tales of going across the desert and the mountains in this early automobile. But this set the stage for what would become the road trip of the future. So the series of highways began to be developed. Rather early on, I was surprised. The Atlantic Highway first opened in 1911. This connected a lot of regional roads, but it was designated a national highway going from Quebec, Canada, all the way to Key West, Florida. Here's a picture of it. You are leaving Key West, Florida, the beginning of US Route number 1 and ending in Fort Kent, Maine. Thank you, come again. This picture looks like maybe it was in the 50s. Probably all of us have been on some segment of US 1, but maybe none of us have been the whole length. But that would be quite a road trip to go from Maine to Key West, Florida. But 1911, rather early on in the automobile era. A few years later, 1913, was the completion of what's called the Lincoln Highway. I had not heard about this, but this is a connection of roads that goes across the United States, right across the middle, from New York to California, 1913. and then Route 50 in 1926. It's called today the loneliest road in America. It goes from Ocean City, Maryland to San Francisco. You can imagine getting, if you want to do a real road trip, get in your car in San Francisco and you'll on Route 50 and you'll see the sign, Ocean City, Maryland, 3,073 miles. Quite a ways yet to go, but you can see how it goes straight across the middle of the country. 1926. In 1926, another road was designated, one that you're probably more familiar with, Route 66 from Chicago to Los Angeles. So this was a real heavily traveled road for commerce as well as migration, because it was built in 1926, not too long before the Great Dust Bowl, the terrible agricultural failures of Oklahoma and around there, where people then migrated from the middle of America to California once again, and they went on Route 66. You've read about that in Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath and probably seen movies and other designations of it. But it was quite a trek, not easy at all, quite despairing for many of the people, but there it is in New Mexico, US Route 66. And you can ride on it today, the parts of it that have been designated as a US historic trail, Chicago to Los Angeles. There was another migration, one that we are not as familiar with, but it was a very important one, particularly for those of us who are from the South. So you had in the early part of the 20th century, terrible conditions, racist conditions, discriminations for African Americans, and almost 2 million African Americans migrated to the North and the West, looking for better living conditions, looking for jobs in factories in the North, and trying to escape the Jim Crow era of the South. And so you can see here the migration treks of the African Americans in what's called the Great Migration North. So that was the highways that they were being developed in the 20s, but really at this time, they weren't the kind of road trip highways that we would think of, because in my mind, it would take several other developments in this country, in our society, for the Great America Road Trip to emerge. And that really you have to go to after World War II, the late 40s, early to mid 50s. And there are several factors that came into play here. First, you had the expansion of the automobile and the fact that it was being mass produced and that a very large and increasingly large middle class of families could afford an automobile. So by the mid 50s, you had the expectation that middle class families would own their own automobile. You had the factor that gasoline was very cheap, particularly if you would compare it in similar years to other parts of the world. So you have access to the automobile, you had cheap gasoline, you had something else, you had family vacations being taken. We kind of take for granted that people will have vacations, that they can go on with their family, but that's not always been the case. But by the 50s, having paid leave vacations for middle class and up people had become normal. And so you had the access, and then you had the expansion of these highways. So the highways, the automobile culture, the middle class, and family vacations led to a great expansion. And I think that you can think back. I'd like to get you to think back to your years in the 1950s and 60s. And I'm willing to bet that you have memories, probably good memories. Maybe you were in the front seat as a driver or the navigator, or maybe you were in the back seat with your siblings. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? But this was an era where American families would hit the road and they would go to great destinations. They would go to the beach. They would go to the mountains. They would go to the burgeoning national parks. I have a picture here, and you should go back and look at your albums too, from the 50s and 60s. A picture here of a nice American family. I don't know how well you can see it. This is my family. On the back, it says, "Our family at Grand Canyon, June 1957. I'm there with my older sister, my baby sister, my younger brother, my parents. And like millions of other American families, we were going to the national parks as a great destination. But what would happen is you didn't just arrive at the destination. You had to get there. and you didn't have the interstate highway system. You didn't have the network of airlines to get you most of the way. And so it would be a road trip so that you would go along the way. Do you remember the Ford Fairlane station wagons with the fake wood trim? Or maybe it wasn't fake, I can't remember. The little camper vans, or maybe a big vacation trailer. So people would camp, they would stop at the motels along the way in order to get there. So if you were going from Atlanta, where I live, to the Grand Canyon in the 50s, you would drive with your family. It would take a while to get there. And so you would have to have a road trip along the way, stopping along the way, stopping at motels or campgrounds along the way before you got to Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, where the beach, wherever your destination might be. So think about those images, and hopefully they'll bring up some mostly pleasant memories of the 50s and 60s. I want to show you some pictures that I got off the internet and ask you just to, as you look at them, I'm not going to have commentary. If you look at them, think about your days back in the 50s and 60s and see if these evoke some memories from those days. Do any of these bring back memories from earlier years for you? Hopefully, maybe they do. I hope so. Here's some more: the beach, the mountains, the Grand Canyon. Don't feed the bears. But road trips were not easy for all Americans. It's interesting for African Americans. A man developed a book that was published every year from the 20s through the 60s, the Negro Motorist Green Book. And it was written for African Americans who wanted to travel too, but needed to know where they could stay, where they could eat in an era of desegregation and overt racism. So it's very into the movie about it. I've not seen the movie, don't know how accurate it is, but I do know that this Green Book served a very interesting and worthwhile purpose for African American families who also wanted to join the road trip generation. Now, during these years, there was other kind of road trips being taken by writers. You have John Steinbeck's book, Travels with Charlie, In Search of America. This was written in 1960. Steinbeck was 59 years old, a well-established, famous writer, and he decided to set out on his own, just on his own, in his camper truck with his dog Charlie, to see the country, but not really just to see it, but to try to get to know it through the people he would encounter along the way. So he calls it In Search of America. It's a great, even now, 60 years later, I reread it a couple of weeks ago and found it fascinating. You can kind of skip over sections, but some of them are really intriguing to read about his observations and his encounters crossing this country in 1960. The second book there, Blue Highways, A Journey into America by William Lease Teat Moon. This is a trip 10 years after Steinbeck's in 1970-71. This man at the time was not famous. He just lost his job. His marriage was on the rocks, and he had an old beat up van, but he decided he wanted to see the country and to record through his journal writing and eventually publishing a book of the America that he found. Again, focusing not so much on the sites, but on the people and the towns that they were in. Now, the name is interesting, Blue Highways. He said in those days, the maps, the road maps, the big highways were in red and the smaller roads were in blue. So his idea was to travel the blue highways, the smaller highways, going through the towns, the villages, so that he could encounter the people on the way. So here's John Steinbeck with his poodle, Charlie, and here's his truck. He was well off by the time, so he could have Ford Motor Company build him a customized camper on the back of a truck. William Lease Teat Moon was not affluent. He had this old van that he converted to be able to be used as a camper van. The routes they followed were remarkably similar. Steinbeck was living up in New England, so he followed around a great circle around. William Least Moon was living in Missouri, so he went to the east and then around and followed around and returned back there. So if you want a look at what America was like from the standpoint of two excellent writers, these two books, John Steinbeck, 1960, William Least Moon, 1970. There are other books too, but these are real classics. But what about us today? The country has changed again from these days when we were going by car from Atlanta to the Grand Canyon. If you live in Atlanta today and you're going to take a vacation to the Grand Canyon, most likely you'll fly to Phoenix and rent a car. It's not necessary to drive all the way. For several reasons, we've continued to have more affluence in this country, but also the network of air travel and the price of air travel has brought that into the reach of more people. So today, when we think about continental trips, we tend to think more of going by air supplemented by rental cars rather than doing those long road trips. But it is possible still to do road trips. And in this era of the pandemic, when it's not advisable to be getting on airplanes and ships as much, it occurred to me that it might be possible to go back to the idea of road trips. I have a couple questions to ask you as you think about this. Do you yearn for the freedom of the open road where the journey is the destination? Here's an important concept for a road trip. So if you're going to go to the Grand Canyon and you fly and you're there, the trip is really the destination. That's your focus. You have to put up with the airports, but you go to the Grand Canyon and that's your trip. If you're driving to the Grand Canyon, the journey itself becomes to a considerable extent the journey that you're taking. So the getting there is half the fun, as we used to say. So the first question is, do you yearn for that kind of open road experience where the journey is the experience? Second question, can the pandemic era lead us back to the wonders of the old road trip when other travel is too restrictive? In other words, we've not thought of these kinds of long road trips because we haven't had to make them. Maybe now we'll have to get back on the road. And if we do, I would suggest that we think in terms of the Great America road trip as a positive, not as a negative. How can we make it a positive? Or for some of you, maybe many of you, you're content to have the road trips of the past be in your memory banks. And you've had enough of those long road trips. And you'll just wait for the pandemic to be past us when we can get back on our airplanes and on our cruise ships and travel that way. So here's some questions for you to be thinking about. But as I've thought about it, I thought, well, what would it look like if we were to do a road trip? I think there's several things that we would keep in mind. One is that we would be going with a group, but it wouldn't be our family. So the seniors like myself, we like to travel as a group. That's part of the fun of travel. After all, it's going with a group, getting to know people. You're on a common trip. And so being together gives great opportunities to get to know each other, to share stories, have new experiences together. And we could do that on a motor coach. Now, I've taken groups on large motor coaches. I think in this era, we would have smaller groups on the same big coaches. So we'd have plenty of space, lots of empty seats, people could spread out. And we would choose top flight hotels. No skimping on that. We would want to get the best so that we can make sure that all the hygiene and all the accommodations were done properly. And when we would have tours, we would have our group broken up into small groups, not more than 10, with a tour guide. So I think there will be ways that the tourist industry will be accommodating to a post-pandemic era when making people feel safe that would in fact be conducive to taking a road trip. So I'm looking forward to the possibility of doing that. Maybe some of you will come with us. I've got a couple of slides to show you that help think about this. So today there are a lot of options for using the highways, the blue highways and the interstates to do a road trip. There are a lot of resources. This is from a internet site that if you're interested in a road trip, it's a great site. It's called Road Trip USA. It has a ton of information on all kinds of road trip opportunities you might do. This is kind of an overview, 11 classic cross-country ones. Now, I'm not sure I'm up for any of the real cross-country ones, but this just illustrates the kind of trips they show. They show a lot of shorter ones too, but here they have east-west ones, north-south one. There's Route 66 that you can still take. That might be a fun one to do, Chicago down to LA. But it's a great website to go to get information. Should we give it a try? I'm living in Atlanta, so I'm thinking about areas that we might go from here. We could go to the low country of Savannah and Charleston. We could do the bluegrass country in Kentucky. Now, Mississippi River, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I said, oh, we'll fly to St. Louis, charter a bus, drive down to St. Louis and to New Orleans and fly back. Well, today we could add a couple of days at either end, take the bus the whole way, stopping along the way at interesting places, both going and coming. We could give some concession to airplanes and go out to the Western National Parks, nonstop flights to Phoenix, coming back from Las Vegas, and take 8 or 10 days on a coach going through those great national parks again. You saw the picture I showed you of my family at Grand Canyon, 1957. I've been back briefly once since then, but I wouldn't mind going back again with a group of my friends on this. Living in Georgia, you could do Florida. I mean, that's a long trip, but you could go down the East Coast, the Atlantic coast, all the way to Key West, come back on the Gulf Coast. It'd be great. There'd be great places to stop, places that we know about, but also some more off the beaten path places as well. Another one from Atlanta would be Arkansas. You go through Alabama, come back through Mississippi, and enjoy the great state of Arkansas. That's the kind of trip that we probably wouldn't have thought about last year. So if I'd asked you last year, well, what are the trips you might want to take this year, I doubt that Arkansas would have been high on the list. But why not? Why not get a group together, get on a nice, big, comfortable motor coach, and head west at least part of the way? So that's it for today in terms of the Great American Road Trip. I hope you'll be thinking about it in two ways. Think about the great trips that you may have had in the past. You get some pleasure from going through and pulling out those old photo albums and thinking about those trips that you had back in the 50s and 60s. But also think about the future and about the potential value in the post-pandemic era, but for its own value, a road trip that goes a little farther than you normally would on the road and maybe off the interstate more, looking to see what you can see of America on your way to some of the great destinations. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining us.